Thank you all so much for attending. I'm very excited about today's webinar. If you missed the live broadcast of our last webinar with Christy Borders, I'd love for you to check it out on our video page, tutorwithpearl.com/webinars. We had a great conversation about the Illinois Tutoring Initiative and rolling out tutoring across the state. Tutoring is the clear evidence-based winner on how to best address the many challenges our students are facing related to learning loss. And as we think about the hurdles to do the right thing by our students, supplying the country with effective tutors is critical. Today's discussion will dive deep into how high-impact tutoring is contributing to closing the gap between education research and practice. Few, if any, educational initiatives are situated with equal footing in research and practice. But as we will discuss today, Americorps and its unique combination of aspirational, policy, and people power provides a rare example. To be sure, Americorps-based tutoring has become an increasingly large part of the K-12 experience. A slightly different format from our previous webinars, this discussion will take a little bit more of a learning approach. My two guests today are from ServeMinnesota. ServeMinnesota acts as a catalyst for positive social impact, working with Americorps and community partners to address critical needs in Minnesota and share proven practices nationally. ServeMinnesota uses data-driven solutions to tackle problems in educational achievement, economic opportunity, housing stability, recovery from substance use disorders, climate mitigation, and so much more. And my guests today include Peter Nelson, Ph.D., a VP of Impact and Innovation, and David Parker, Ph.D., VP of Research and Development. They are co-leaders of the National Science and Service Collaborative at ServeMinnesota, which includes research and development efforts, including new program design, program evaluation, and innovation, and the development of robust data management systems. Peter has more than 10 years of experience in research and evaluation methodology with a particular focus on the educational context. Before joining ServeMinnesota, Peter was an assistant professor of school psychology at Penn State. Peter has a PhD from the University of Minnesota in school psychology. David Parker brought to ServeMinnesota a deep commitment to researching and developing tools that adults need to help students acquire literacy and math skills. He has a PhD in educational psychology from the University of Minnesota, and along with Peter and other colleagues, has published dozens of scientific articles on how to improve educational processes and outcomes for children. We plan to divide today's webinar into a couple of key insights. We'll talk about Mathcorps and how it plays a key role in getting high quality math instruction delivered straight to students. How Americorps-based tutoring programs serve as a model for intelligent data-based decision-making. How tutoring could become a core right in K-12 education, which is a super exciting concept to me. And lastly, the opportunities to bridge the research practice gap in education in the United States. So we're going to jump into Mathcorps a little bit, but before we dive in, I'd love to learn a little bit more about each of you and how you came to work at ServeMinnesota, maybe a little bit also some background on Americorps to make sure folks have a clear context. Dave, I'll pass it to you.
All right, well, hi everybody. Thank you so much, Nate, for having us. This is kind of a neat opportunity for us to share both our work and I think some neat conversations that came out of well, when Nate and I met at a national conference on tutoring hosted by the National Student Support Accelerator. So there's a lot of neat things I think we can share that we're doing on this topic of tutoring, closing the research to practice gap, and also some thought work. Like Nate said, it's a learning session. So we're excited to be a part of that conversation, hopefully start some with you all and beyond. Really quick background on myself. I have an educational psychology degree from the University of Minnesota, where I spent a lot of time caring a lot and thought I would go into an academic career working on research related to, like I think Nate said in the bio, the tools adults need to help students be successful with a particular interest in early literacy and math skills. And then this work found me. The executive director of our Americorps work here knew Americorps, knew its emphasis on evidence, its emphasis on getting things done, and really had a strong intuition. Her name was Audrey Suker. She's still leading the work that she started 20 plus years ago, and she saw the value for research and evidence in advancing what Americorps can do, and kind of recruited me in, and that led to others and Pete, and now we're stuck here. We're not going anywhere. It's a pretty neat privilege to have that equal footing that Nate mentioned at the outset. So, thanks. Nice to be here.
Pass it to you, Peter.
All right, and David, when I'm done, you can kind of maybe do a little Americorps overview.
I'd be happy to.
But I joined ServeMinnesota primarily because of David brought me over. We were at the time working together on an impact evaluation while I was at Penn State Math Corps, actually. And I was really enjoyed my time in higher ed, and was spending a lot of my research work focused on database decision making in schools, sort of academic intervention, but just really felt siloed in those efforts. I felt like the folks I was talking to about my work were other colleagues, right? It wasn't really finding its way into schools in the way that I had hoped it would. And in working with ServeMinnesota, really saw an opportunity there to kind of bridge both, do the work I love, but also have that work inform programming in a pretty rapid way, folding in those findings into our programs. And that's what brought me here.
So yeah, Nate, thanks for queuing us up to talk a little bit about the context for this conversation, which is focused around two evidence-based tutoring programs that are delivered with Americorps members. But how do we get there? And so I'm going to try to just in hopefully 60 seconds or less take you down the steps or the chinks in the line for how we get there. So folks may know, and some may not know, that the Americorps program idea, it's a federal department, was started under the Clinton administration. So we're going on 30 years, I think. I think next year might be the 30th anniversary of Americorps. And Americorps exists to activate the goodwill of communities to solve community problems. And just with that alone, I think it's very clear how Americorps has huge potential within education. And so when we were able to operationalize some programs for Americorps members to support tutoring in schools, it was an idea that really took, and then it took root, and now it's spreading around the country. It's presently serving, between these two programs, around 40,000 students, or maybe more than that next year, in 15 states, plus the District of Columbia, 1,500 sites. So it's one of those few programs that has both a strong evidence base, we can talk about that, and also demonstrated scale. And that's a pretty neat engine and context for thinking about research to practice and how Americorps is delivering research-based and evidence-based activities, but also how there could be a feedback loop. And so a little bit more of the logistics about what we're talking about, what happens in the tutoring program, just so you can have some of those details in mind. In both programs, we've got an Americorps member embedded into the school day, which is consistent with recommendations for how tutoring should happen. And that Americorps member in the school, during the school day, provides schools that extra resource to, in both programs, really, it's basically 90 to 100 minutes of individualized support delivered one-on-one or in small groups. And that's run with a pretty strong data-based decision-making element to it. So data informs all the decisions about who should be getting the services, how they're doing when they may not need the services. And then on top of all of that, there's a pretty unique, in our view, investment in implementation infrastructure, specifically around coaching. So each of these Americorps members get coaching throughout the term of their service. So you can imagine all the way through the academic school year, when kids are there and they're doing their support, they get ongoing coaching from not one, but a couple different folks. So and you can imagine how we use that to ensure the database decision-making is done in an optimal way, and how the actual delivery of the evidence-based instruction is done in an optimal way as well.
So that's awesome. I think it's so important to understand that context. And now I'd like to kind of narrow in and talk specifically about Mathcorps. So I'd love to learn more about Mathcorps in general, and then dive in a little bit into how the instruction was developed. So David, maybe we start with you there.
Yeah, let's start there. And I want to try to connect with the theme of the session, which is, if we start at what is research to practice, I think that research to practice, we can think of it in a lot of different ways, but if we think of it at the highest level, it's basically getting a solution to the people who need it. And research being the solution. In this case, it's usually an evidence-based practice. And the people who need it being students who might benefit from that additional support. And so at that highest level, Mathcorps is, you don't really have to overthink it. And this is similar for tutoring. We're going to talk a lot about these programs that we've been working on for years, but tutoring, I think, is going to be front and center in a lot of folks' minds as well. But tutoring, Mathcorps in this example, allows the delivery of evidence-based practices in math instruction. And so that's important because we know that schools are limited resource and limited capacity places. A lot of schools have invested in some areas of remedial support or supplementary support, but if schools were to do it all, that's going to tax the system big time. So from a research to practice standpoint, one high level theme here that I think we want to pay attention to is that tutoring can just get it done. And when there's a feasible mechanism for providing tutoring, and there's a lot of different models, and I hope to unpack a few, and I know Nate can mention some from Pearl's work as well. When there's a feasible mechanism to do that, all the better. With Mathcorps, well, let me just pause there and see, Nate or Pete, what would you guys like to add there? So I can dive into Mathcorps in a few different ways.
I think that's great context. And with Mathcorps, the redesign of Mathcorps, really 7-8 years ago or whatever that was really the position that we started in, right? Who are the folks what's the literature we want to reference? Who are the folks we need to be talking to in the community? There are literal best practice guides that just exist, online, that are a culmination of years and years and years of research on math intervention, math tutoring, as well as sort of just general best practices for tutoring. And I think that was one of the primary reference points for you, David, in your work. Again, I was sort of not in the picture here at this point.
Well, you came in quick. But yeah, I mean, it was an opportunity to take kind of the simple, thanks for that. I mean, it really was an example of if we know what to do and kind of how to do it, kind of how do we put that into practice? And some seminal things out there in the math literature, like folks have maybe heard of the National Reading Panel. That was a seminal directive idea for organizing literacy. Well, equivalents exist in math, like the National Mathematics Advisory Panel. And if you think about a research to practice standpoint, that was very clear in defining what math skills might be highest yield. And so when we were thinking about Mathcorps, we could turn to that and say, that's what we should focus on. And that's in terms of what skills to work on. So that the next question would be, how do you improve those skills? And other seminal documents that are just incredibly helpful from a distilling research to practice standpoint, like the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides, were very instructive on how to do that. And then basically you can kind of combine those three things together, the what to work on, how to do it, and how to deliver it, the last part being the Americorps member. That's really how Mathcorps kind of came together.
So this is really interesting to me because if you think about traditional sort of tier 1 school approach, there's sort of this one size fits all at the school or at the district level. When they're approaching math, they may have kind of said, okay, we've acquired this LMS for math. This is the curriculum we're going to use for math. And they get kind of set in their ways, right? And so the tutoring becomes kind of this, whether interventional or whatever, it becomes this place where you can say, hey, perhaps there's this opportunity to try some new things. Perhaps we can look at the most recent research and say, maybe some of this flies a bit counter to what's happening in that sort of more balanced environment at the tier 1 level. But we can actually start to do some experimentation, and perhaps that experimentation can creep into some of the ways that the folks are looking at how they teach within like the traditional school setting.
Right. And it forces you to prioritize a little bit too. So if you think about a kindergartner, like, yes, I care that kid knows what a circle is and can identify shapes, but I care a lot more if they can use a number line, put numbers on a number line, understand that, 10 is more than 8, but it's 2 more than 8, and to really kind of understand what that means. And so it allows you to focus in on content that you think is going to be high yield for the school. And we'll talk about this later, but this has to do a lot with fit, like fitting your tutoring model, whatever it might be, into the sort of school ecosystem. Right. Is also important. It also lets you think about, like, in a classrooms, the constraint is that you have to hold time constant and allow achievement to vary, because there's only so much time in their sequencing. Now, tutoring introduces the possibility to hold achievement constant and allow time to vary. And that's another interesting thing that you can think about when you're thinking about tutoring programs. And I don't think that when we're talking about building MathCorps, I don't think there's anything like secret about what we're doing. I mean, we were referencing publicly available information. And so I think there's no reason that other folks out there couldn't be thinking about it the same way. I mean, accessing these resources and thinking about what's happening in their school, and how they might be able to sort of infuse these concepts into creating a little bit more of a rigorous approach to tutoring, a more systematic approach to tutoring.
So and now that you have this approach, right, which has this capacity to try different things, it's so interesting, because I just got off the phone with our partners in the NSSA, and we were really talking about one of our problems on the ground is we'd love to, like, within a specific district, be releasing 2 different student experiences in a randomized way so that we could actually compare and contrast those 2 specific, and maybe it's a completely different user experience, maybe it's a different way that we build relationships with tutors, but to be able to compare those. So have you have this strong approach to math instruction. How did your organization think about releasing it straight to the students? Like, what did that look like on the ground?
Well, I'll start there and maybe hand it over to Pete, because I think that's a neat kind of whole narrative by itself. But we were able to leverage the existing network of schools in a different tutoring model, the Reading Corps, right? So we already knew that there was an appetite for providing schools that support a person. So, like, if we think about, like, how do we get MathCorps done, we can communicate with the schools that are already kind of leveraging an evidence-based tutoring program in the form of Reading Corps, communicate with them, get that MathCorps kind of along for the ride. That's kind of a very practical, just kind of how do we expand it.
Yep.
But I think there's a neat example in another practice question that immediately bridges back to research in do we deliver this model, right? The 90 minutes of tutoring / intervention support that the MathCorps member in a school can provide. Do we deliver that in one-on-one, pairs, or groups of 3? And this is an area research base that is kind of up for discussion. There's ongoing research on kind of how is the student opportunity to respond and learn impacted by however many other students there are in a tutoring session. And I believe we do a lot of this work. So I believe I'm not making this up, and I want to transition it over to Pete, but we have the capacity to actually research by doing that kind of randomized rollout of different options, where you can look at groups of 2 or groups of 3, which has a huge practical implication in the number of students that we can serve. And we can look at how student outcomes then may be different or the same, and have a pretty good degree of confidence on how we can, within our evidence-based tutoring program, deliver MathCorps in terms of student kind of group size.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think, David, you hit on the critical piece, which is just in terms of how to get it out, it's literally just people. I mean, so if you have a good program, you need people, like you need the people to deliver that support. And in the case of Americorps, it fits really well because you've got this group of people, passionate people that who want to be out in schools doing this work. And then for us, the question is, well, how do we support them and organize their work in such a way that we can be maximally, impactful and a fit for schools? And so there are a number of projects, group size, those kinds of things, like characteristics of tutors that we've done. But that's all sort of iterative, right? We're always kind of doing that. But the key piece here is just, that's how we get it out. It's just literally tapping into the Americorps infrastructure is what allows us to disseminate a program like MathCorps.
And that isn't the only, Nate, I know you guys have talked about this, but I think if we want to get tutoring out to as many schools and students as possible, it's good when we can all kind of acknowledge and high five the other options, right? So Americorps is one infrastructure that exists statewide and across states. It's one of the neat things about it. Wherever there's community, there's an Americorps member. Wherever there's community, there's schools. So there's a lot of potential there. But in some communities, you have things like universities, institutes of higher education, where there's teacher prep programs or other educational related prep programs. And that's a really great opportunity for tapping state resources to ensure tutoring gets spread.
Yeah, I mean, I tell the story about the Illinois Tutoring Initiative. That's, the biggest initiative that we work with. And obviously, Christy's story of kind of getting that started was a real huddle between, the Department of Higher Ed, the governor's office, the DOE, talking to those districts and figuring out like really what is the best implementation plan. Because there's always these pieces on the ground that make it really, there's a tremendous amount of friction in getting these started. And it sounds like having those Americorps folks, on the ground with community is kind of like a great way to spark those things to happen. The other thing we're thinking a lot about, as you know, is just intelligent database decision-making. And how is it that we ensure that if we're implementing great design, that we can actually prove that it's working. Not only that, in reading a lot of your research, there was definitely, I could see this desire to start thinking about like, how do we know when someone's done with an intervention? Like, how do we know when their tutoring is done? Or how do we know specifically that this particular person is going to be responsive to one design over another? And, like, how do we think about specifically collecting the data that's necessary? So, Pete, I'd love for you to take this one. How are you collecting the data to prove efficacy, particularly in the math programs? And what data have you determined is critical to collect and report specifically?
Yeah. So the how, I'll just quickly say, so we over several years now worked to create a data system, right, that's built around these tutoring programs. And so you either are accessing a flexible data system, Pearl's got, you can kind of build the data system around a program. And that's really the best approach, because when you think about efficacy and what data should we collect to like make sure that we're working, so to speak, I think it's really useful to think broadly about efficacy. And instead of just if you're a tutoring program, instead of just thinking about academic outcomes, because of course you want to track academic outcomes, but think about what is your theory of change and the assumptions that you're making there. Because even if you don't think you have a theory of change and you're running a tutoring program, you do. It exists. Like, you're making some assumptions that, for example, you can find folks that are a good fit, that you can train them, that they're implementing the tutoring with a certain degree of fidelity. You're likely making some assumptions that students are responding to that tutoring in similar kinds of ways. And that includes more than just academic outcome data, right? So you really want to think about your data system as totally lockstep with how you think about the tutoring delivery and the impact of that tutoring, because you want to make sure you're in a position to evaluate those assumptions that you have about your program. So with that in mind, our data system is basically made of 5 tables, right? There are 3 demographic tables. There's one for students. So who are the students that we're serving? There's one for the tutors. So we know a fair bit about who our tutors are, their background is, kind of what they are looking for, their career, those kinds of things. That is all very helpful. And then we have some information about the school. So, what's the context in which these interventions and this tutoring is occurring? So those are the 3 demographic tables. And then we have an implementation record, which is essentially a daily log of which interventions tutors are using, how and for how long, kind of attendance records, how well they're implementing those interventions as well. So we have this sort of daily record that also includes some observational data from those coaches that we mentioned previously. There are basically two coaches that support the members, one that's a program coach and one that's an internal coach at the school. Now, these are folks they're observing the tutors, and then they're recording their observations into a data system that we can connect to everything else. So then the last table we have are the academic outcomes. So for both tutoring programs, math and reading, you've got your seasonal benchmark data, so fall, winter, spring. And then we'll also have progress monitoring data. In the case of reading, it's weekly progress monitoring data for students. And then we're also tapping into the state data as well, so state test data. So there are other ways, there's certainly other ways to think about what data you collect. We think we're in a pretty good position, but but the point that I really want to make here is that, that's the data we're collecting for these programs. But what's most important when we're thinking about data systems, at least I think, is not just thinking about, oh, that's just the data we should always collect, and this is the best approach to collecting data. Because I think it's more about aligning your data system with your programming. What's going to be most useful to you? What kind of questions do you have about your program? How are you going to position yourself to not just talk about impact in terms of academic outcomes, but improvement in impact, but also improvement in implementation and training, all of these things. And you want some kind of data so you're in a position to make these decisions.
Yeah, and I think we talk a lot at Pearl about this perspective of the administrator, the evaluator, and the researcher. And at whatever design we're thinking about, we're trying to step into the shoes of each one of those. The administrator being, I want to make sure things are running smoothly. I want to make sure the logistics are taken care of. The evaluator is like, in real time, there's a problem, we need to fix that problem. Or some component of our design, perhaps it's for a practical reason, is not working. And that could be attendance, right? It could be a lot of different things. And then on the research side, particularly in our conversations with the folks at Brown, it's really about like, remember guys, you need to randomize this, or remember guys that you need to make sure that you give two experiences, as I spoke to before. But as you glean insights from data, as that data is coming in whatever format based on the design, how are you driving new teaching behaviors and making real-time corrections, improving the curriculum design?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to bring up about the different users, because it's certainly, in one sense, the data system that our tutors use is intended to support real-time decision-making for them. So there's sort of a collaborative effort between the tutor, the coach, and the coaches about this data is coming in, implementation data, outcome data. What does this mean for implementation? What can we tweak in real time that week or that day? We're going to look at these data. And that means that as a system, you have to create the interface for them to be in a position to make those decisions. And then as an administrator or a principal who wants to know how things are going at the school, we also need to think about, well, can we create something that's actually going to be useful to them? Because maybe they don't want to know about just that individual kid. They want to see things at just a little step above. And so that data system really supports those kinds of decisions. But selfishly, what I'm most interested in are these sort of program improvement efforts that are a little bit more on like an annual or semi-annual schedule. And this is where I think we've been able to do the most interesting work when it comes to driving new tutoring behaviors or improving curriculum design, right? And it's not always like you're sitting with a data file and you're just kind of looking at the data and you say, oh, I see that, and now we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We do talk to you, part of this is, you talk to folks about who are involved in the program, teachers, kids, researchers. People pass along stuff to us all the time. And the data system helps us sort of evaluate those questions and kind of iterate with those. But there are actually examples where we've looked at the data and observed patterns that kind of are a springboard for us for a series of larger projects. And I think one of those that I'll just mention is in the context of Reading Corps. We were seeing a large number of kids who were just skyrocketing, doing really well during tutoring support. So they're there every day. And then the program, the way it's structured, those students sort of graduate when they reach a certain level, grade level, performance on their literacy skills. so that they can make room on their caseload for a kid who maybe needs the support a little bit more.
Yeah.
But how to do that, there isn't really a lot of guidance. There's a lot of good empirical guidance in the research literature about how do we increase resources. You know, we're all really good about that. Like when's a kid not responding, and when do we really need to layer on more supports? But not a lot of guidance about how to scaffold that off.
Yeah.
So for us, there was a contribution there to say, hey, you guys, like, look, everybody knows this is happening. You talk to teachers, they'll tell you, you know, but to start to quantify that. What does a kid's slope look like during intervention? And what does their slope look like when you remove that intervention? And what does that mean for tutoring? And what does
how
that
do you
mean?
measure it, right? Like, I mean, how do you keep the continuity? It's your point of like scaffolding off. Like, how would you even continue to collect the data that would be necessary to understand the tail of the work you did, right?
Yeah, and so for us, is part of the work in quantifying the nature of that regression after intervention also was a bit of an intervention of itself. So we did sort of a quasi-experimental design where we wanted to see what would be the benefit of just folding in one extra, just have the kid come and read and practice reading out loud with the tutor once a week. Mm-hmm. Instead of 5 times a week, just have them come back once a week, just among the exited kids. So that allowed us, one, to quantify what the rate of growth was after intervention. But we also saw that relative to kids who weren't doing that, we were seeing about a 10% increase in the probability of them meeting their spring benchmark at the end of the year. So then the next step for us was, this is the good thing about having a kind of a wide infrastructure. We just randomly assign 50 schools to do what we call post-exit progress monitoring. It's a really catchy.
So you guys were receiving the outcome data even after the program ended for that student substantive.
Yes. So we stayed in touch to continue to get the data on the student. And then we replicated the QED results and saw, okay, well, the lowest hanging fruit here is like, let's just stay connected with that student because we're going to see more of our kids staying on track. And I just wanted to use that example because that was something that really originated, in our data. We saw a pattern and is now kind of grown into a larger research project that we're working on, a 4-year project through IES to think about skill profiles for kids. Can we better predict who's going to not just respond to intervention, but maintain progress after intervention? Is there something about the kid's skill profile? Also, is there something that's happening in their classrooms? So we're out now observing in classrooms, like figuring out what are the things that teachers are doing to support the tutoring, right? To help those kids maintain their skills that they acquired during tutoring.
And are you guys also looking at social emotional learning data as kind of part of like understanding what like making some kind of determination as to how well they'll do in this sort of relationship-based learning experience?
So on the data side, we do have some measures of what I would say fall under social emotional skills or learning, or however you want to phrase it. That's an area where I think I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that as you think about a tutoring program, especially academic tutoring program, we can forget that relationship side, that emotional side that we know matters, and not just for the student, but the relationship with the tutor. I mean, you all hopefully, if you don't like somebody, you don't want to do work for them. You don't want to work with them at all. So like, it really does matter. You do want to connect with these kids. It's a thing that we know is important, but the measurement of that in a meaningful way is something that we're still working through how to best do that, because we also have the mind that we love data, but we don't want to collect data that we can't use, right? We want multiple users, right? That means tutors, principals, us. We want people to see the data and then have that prompt something for them.
Well, I just had this conversation with Alex Cortez 2 weeks ago at Bellwether, and he's a big proponent of just trying to put mechanisms in place to avoid the weaponization of data. So often we make these choices based on the data that we collect, and we have this autonomy, maybe even as researchers, trying to do things in a scientific way of choosing the data we collect. And oftentimes now we make these macro decisions, or we tell policymakers that this is what we know to be true. And that's not always the way it goes on the ground,
Right. And we do try to position our, because it's a real thing. I mean, even our close partners at Reading for Americorps are a little like, you know, are you who are you evaluating here? And we've tried to position it as evidence for improvement, not necessarily evidence for impact. I mean, of course it's impact, but like trying to reposition is like, this is going to allow us to get better. These data are allowing us to get better. And it's, you know, it is a little bit of a tricky space to really get buy-in, full-on buy-in from folks into the process of database decision-making, because it can be, you know, it's a double-edged sword.
And I think,
you know?
I think it's okay to start small, right? So like, the data we're talking about right now, based on your question, right, is what's the relationship quality? Well, we don't have a robust and comprehensive data point for that in some of these programs, but what we do have is in that coaching and support and fidelity infrastructure, where there's a coach providing some feedback to the tutor on how things are going, a clear data point that kind of, as Pete said, feeds into what is the quality of that relationship. And I think that you don't have to think too hard to see the power of even that singular data point. That gives some objectivity and a metric, right, to make future database decision makings for the coach to say, so here's something that I saw and I observed. It's subjective. Fully admit that there's room for improvement, but that's still a data point that can be the focus of ground level dyadic conversations about how it's looking in the tutoring sessions, but then also rolls up into the kinds of analysis and programmatic evaluation and research that we can do. And we've even used data points like that to be able to determine things like in our research, it matters more, I think, to do good fidelity than it does to be a good mathematician yourself. Yeah. Right? When you have those kinds of data, you can actually start answering those questions. That's actually really interesting. We've kind of put that into practice once we knew that, and now we kind of know, you know, who can be a successful math tutor, and that's kind of a really encouraging message for the broader community.
Yeah, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just because of time, and David, you and I chatted a couple of times at the National Student Support Conference and Accelerator Conference. And I think we both at one time or another expressed our excitement about the enthusiasm for tutoring and its potential to become sort of more of a normalized student educational experience. That excitement was tempered a bit, as we all know, by all the many barriers to entry. I've talked about criminal background checks, all of these things that kind of come into play as friction points. Can you give me a sense as to what would need to be true to make tutoring more of a human right, like part of the education K-12 experience? Or are we just dreaming here? I mean, do you think it's possible?
No, I'm going to start real practical. That might be the theme from the feedback on how David did here in this session. But I mean, I don't think it behooves any of us to skip over really viable models. And I'll try to hit a few, right? If you start with just what Americorps has done, and you think about how do you get tutoring to as many students as possible, I mentioned at the outset that these programs are nationally in, I think, serving 40,000 students, but in Minnesota alone, they're serving 25,000. That's where it's been around the longest. So if you just do the simple math there, you can get to, if you assume something like states, because it's been done before intentionally, and you can say Americorps members are a good tutor. They are a viable option. They can get statewide. We're in rural communities, we're in urban communities, and that adds up to 25,000 students in a state. And you do that proportionally, you get over 1 million in 50 states. And you get there pretty quickly. And in some states, it could be much greater than that. And that's not aspirational, that's proven. That's because wherever there's people, there's community. Wherever there's community, there's schools. Wherever there's community, there's Americorps members. So that's a really, I think, important thing to acknowledge. And in that same vein, there's other, I think, demonstrated models that are at various stages in demonstrating their evidence base. But you got to mention again the opportunity to leverage institutes of higher education. And I think there's a lot of sub-models to do that. In the same vein, there's excellent models that are leveraging older adults, experience corps, foster grandparents. They can be trained. Older adults who are in later stages of their career or into early retirement, they make up a big contingent of our work, but they may prefer a different model. But
Yeah.
those models exist. And I think when you add all of those up, like I said, this is a very practical initial hot take. But you get to the numbers that some of those aspirational goals for tutoring being a part of the solution in the post-pandemic world, you get there. And I don't think we can miss that. That is a really neat opportunity. From there, you get into some of the policy space where you've got policymakers and you've got educators kind of coming together to see where that fit can be. And then you get into the infrastructure space. And I think that's where it's neat that there are initiatives focused on ensuring that the kind of database decision making that we're just talking about, that we were engaged in kind of pre-pandemic and still using, that infrastructure is going to be there, complements of the commitment to collecting the data, right? So that you can demonstrate the impact of whatever the model might be, and then you can commit to that ongoing improvement. Not to mention, those ongoing database decision making on the ground level, like Pete mentioned.
Yeah, like, that I bring up my son's school a lot because it's a rare model. It is an Orton Gillingham school, but my son has a dedicated Orton Gillingham language fundamentals instructor that meets with him for 1 hour, 4 days a week for the entire school year. So into the structure of the school, you have full-time teachers who are there and they have classes. And then they have a literal army of one-on-one Orton Gillingham trained language fundamental tutors for instructors that each year are making a commitment to 4 students or 5 students each. And these are contract employees. They're not full-time teachers, but they are teaching 4 or 5 kids every day, 4 days a week. So, in the end, it's fairly full-time. And so we maintain at the school somewhere between 20 and 25 full-time tutors, for lack of a better word, for those kids. And I'm wondering if that's a model that we could start to see happening in the real world in public schools, where you have, people who really specialize in tutoring who are part of the full-time staff at a school.
And I think there's a continuum there that works in our favor. So depending on the degree of the student need, however we're going to look at that, you can turn a dial a little bit on what the tutor is trained in and their background and their level of support, and all that translates into cost. And then that's on one end of the spectrum, perhaps. And then on the other end of the spectrum, on the dial are volunteers. They are trained service. They're non-professionals, but they're highly trained. They're highly supported. They're highly coached. And you don't have to look far in the research base to find out that all are good. All make a significant impact to students' learning. And I think when you keep that continuum in mind, you can see there's options to ensure that that same continuum of need that exists in the school can have a tutor. There's a tutor for you, right? And I like thinking of it in that way. Pete, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, Nate, inherent in what you're talking about is a certain level of sophistication around tutoring. So part of this, I think, also is, what is tutoring, right? I think we really have to define what it is and have that be sophisticated, right? And what's not tutoring, so that when you go out to like, if I went out to a school and asked teacher, and this happens, you'd say, well, where is this student? And they would say, well, he's with Brad doing math stuff. Is that tutoring? I don't know. How often? It kind of varies week to week, and sometimes it's 20 minutes and sometimes it's on Fridays. What are they doing?
Sometimes the parents paying for it, and it's like whenever the parents are willing to pay the
and
$30.
It can be very from the hip. And I think to get kind of this sort of national push for thinking about where does tutoring fit, I think we also have to be clear about what is good tutoring. It doesn't mean one tutoring program, but there are certain facets of good tutoring, right? Yeah. And kind of good design. And to hold to that standard, then you can start to think about how is this embedded into schools in meaningful ways, and start to really get folks who are leaders in education to think about tutoring, not just as something that's sort of like kind of like ad hoc we're doing and just like getting people from the community and they can pop in now and again, but we're doing tutoring, and this is a fundamental piece of how we support kids. I think that so part of the issue is just kind of defining that.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. So I want to time box maybe 5 or 6 minutes to really kind of culminate into hearing from both of you. And we'll start with you, Pete. there are so many amazing insights that are gleaned from research, and it's true for education, but naturally I'm super curious about the insights from tutoring research specifically. And as we think about shaping, and thinking about bridging this research practice gap, and we support teachers on the ground, to talk a little bit about those findings and that correlation, because and this is really sort of that a culmination of like the insights that we can kind of gather from this talk.
Yeah, and I'll flip it to David in a second. What I really want to say here is just that I think there's a lot that we can learn, not just about impact of tutoring programs, but as I was talking about earlier, thinking about these research partnerships where we're understanding how tutoring best fits within sort of schools' ecosystems. And so that includes sort of top-down work, like infusing research into tutoring and how those practices can inform the other processes happening at that school, whether it's like system-wide decision-making, like data-based kind of things at the school level, or kind of what's happening in the classroom. But the other side of sort of strengthening this sort of research and tutoring and practice together is sort of authentic involvement of the community. I think schools often feel like with like research, they think about it as external to the school. And I think the more that we can actually partner with teachers, partner with principals, make them not just informing them of research and saying, hey, here's this evidence-based program, but engaging them in that work, having them as collaborators when we're doing projects. So if we're doing a research project on Reading Corps, a tutoring program in schools, we want to include teachers. We don't want to have them think about it as something that's being, this program is doing research on us. The more we can connect with schools to think about research as a collaborative partnership, I think that is a huge way we can start to see more of these practices that we're learning about tutoring finding their way into schools just by a matter of involving people in the process.
Is there a world where like a teacher on the ground like would participate to the degree which they would be listed as a co-author or something like that? Like really getting them to, I'm thinking about my wife as a doctor and, her support of residents who are doing research and how they end up, who's the lead author, co-author and all of that.
Yeah, we've written, this has been a few years, but we've written some papers about screening. So like, how do you make decisions with data about who should get supports? Mm-hmm. And in doing so, I partnered with people in the school, and then they are getting really interested. The good thing is that they're seeing the learnings from that research and then folding it into their practice because they were an active collaborator in the project. And we're not just like sending them the paper when we're done. And then we include them in writing. We literally include them in writing the paper. And that, I think there is opportunity there. And like I said, I think that is the way to kind of infuse research and practice is blend research and practice. And then, we'll see more research in practice, and we'll see more practice-oriented questions in research, because these people are like, oh, what about this, that, or the other thing? And, there's no way we would have got there unless we actually are engaging with them in the research process.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I've heard from teachers directly, my brother's a principal, so I hear it from him, I hear it from my teacher friends. These students, they come out of these wonderful programs of education. They've spent 99% of their time learning a bunch of education theory, not a lot of clinical experience. They walk into the school, and they get eaten alive, but maybe they're excited, right? Maybe they're excited because they've learned a lot of new research. They've learned about how to do things sort of like a new pedagogical approaches, but they hit a wall of, well, this is how we do it at this school. Or they hit a wall of teachers that have been there for 20, 30 years and have done it pretty well and really don't want things to change. And so there's always this kind of interesting dissonance as folks come out of a research kind of environment, an academic kind of environment, and are faced with sort of the reality of the clinical experience to start with, right? Getting eaten alive in a class of 30 kids, but then also the other teachers who are sort of surviving and have really figured out how to make it work within the context of whatever ESSA kind of requirements are held over their head.
Can I just say we've got some community research partnerships, and now we're early in kind of developing this muscle, but we have community research partnerships that kind of do exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right now, they're focused on ensuring our programs are maximally relevant for various different cultures in different parts of the country and different students' backgrounds and languages. And it doesn't have to stop. It doesn't have to stop there, but that's a really powerful opportunity to get teachers to be the partners. They are doing the research. They are leading focus groups. They are leading interviews. They are giving us the high quality data. And yeah, they would be authors.
Yeah. And ultimately, like there could even be, I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't also maybe pay them, right? Like,
And we do.
like there's a
Yeah.
grant, we can allocate funds from this grant to subsidize the work that you would do as a co-author and a participator in this, you know, and you, so you do that.
So I'll just real quick, explicitly. So when we're getting research grants, I would love to see researchers incentivized to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like incentivized to incentive, to have incentives for community partnership, to have clear community voice, and to have an expectation of what's the long-term plan for what you're finding in this multi-million-dollar federally funded research project. The fact that that could just exist and not find its way into practice is ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
That there's not an expectation that you're going to fund an intervention development, and then there's no expectation that that's going to be in schools 10 years later or 5 years later if you find out that it works. That's insane.
It's insane. Yeah. So, well, let's move to Q&A because we have a bunch of questions that have come in from folks, and we had questions that came in from the registration. We probably only have a time for one or two, but I'm gonna pick some. Before we move to questions, I want to thank everyone for attending. These are amazing times for the tutoring industry, and I really believe that as educators, we have an unprecedented opportunity to change education through one-on-one and small group learning. So let's get to some Q&A. So from the web chat today, I thought this one was really interesting. What are your thoughts on tutors observing classes and using that information to support students in math? But could be anything, right? But let's take that math. I think that's a really interesting one.
Well, I think the short answer there is our thoughts are that's a great thought. That is an intentional suggestion and thing we support for our new tutors. And I think to the whoever asked this question, some of the background context there is that you've got tutors that may be unfamiliar with either the curriculum or the way that the teacher is approaching it. In our case, it's an Americorps member that may be unfamiliar with all sorts of things, and they're still learning how to deliver the evidence-based instruction. And so observing the teacher in their classroom to be able to use the same language to reinforce things that they're seeing, that's absolutely, I mean, it's a critical part. It's how we recommend they spend their early days getting familiar with their role.
Interesting.
Yeah, we've seen better outcomes. We have a few programs, a program specifically that I don't need to go into detail about, other than to say the tutors are in the classroom as well. So they're doing tutoring, and then they're also spending time in the classroom. And the kids getting tutored do better. And the kids in the classroom who are not receiving tutoring, because we actually get data on those kids too, are also doing better. So, right. So it's a good idea, right? It's a good idea. I think tutoring has to be, well, it is for us, curriculum agnostic, but that doesn't mean that there's not something really valuable in understanding what's happening in that classroom for that kid. So yes, I think it's a great thought.
So this is another great question. So has there been research on technologies that will help with creating small tutoring groups based on academic attributes? So IEP, 504 plan, grade level, et cetera, when virtually tutoring several hundreds of students across the state? That's kind of a complicated question. One of you want to take that one?
I'll hit a pop-up foul ball. Maybe Pete can catch it and then, toss it up and hit it farther. I'm a school psychologist. Well, actually, I think both Pete and I are both school psychologists by training. It's been 10 years, but I'm confident that some software exists, some technological support exists out there, because it's a big market area. In terms of how to make that connection from kind of 504 plans and IEPs to what are we actually doing to serve the students, I don't know of great technology-based models that at the end of the day you could plug in, or that take any information you have from evaluations and assessments of those nature and put them in. I would put in a plug for looking in places like Johns Hopkins Tutoring with the Lightning Squad, where it is a technology-based tutoring program that probably requires a little more human intervention than what the question is maybe hoping for. But once it's done, once that human intervention, and by human intervention, the effort to kind of coordinate the groups, the technology really does implement a lot of the evidence-based instruction. And I know they've got some really promising results there, and that's done by Success for All.
Yeah, it's student profile stuff, right? So if the end goal is to say, we know this about you, so we want to group you together, and you're going to be better off because we kind of have you matched with this service, then that means that, like, at the other side, this means you have to have that information about these kids, right? Yeah. And then be in a position to analyze that information with your data to understand how are there groupings, right? Or does it not matter? Does having a 504 plan matter? Does your grade level matter? I don't know. I mean, you create the data system to help you answer those questions, and then the product of that, the front-facing product of that is these groupings. And I think it's more of a technical question than it is. I mean, you certainly can do this, and you certainly will see profiles. It's a technical question, right? So it's understanding, how do you have a data system that actually does that for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you also have to have data to, like, right. So I think about this in the same way I think about the matching algorithm we built, at least in its early stages right now, but we built this matching algorithm for Illinois Tutoring Initiative, and it looked at mandatory data, which was basically like logistics, language, all of those things that have to be true to create a match. And then we have all of this preferential data, the things that we know about the tutor, the things we know about the student, which over time, as we cohort and learn how the mandatory data matches perform, we can start to understand how to weight the preferential data pieces, and then the algorithm will then learn from there. What I think is interesting about this question is that it implies that there is another step, which is perhaps these 2 or 3 people, because of the data we have about those 2 or 3 people, will actually learn better in an environment than, another set of matches, right? So it's not just about matching a tutor with an instructor, but it could also be about like these 3 kids with this tutor. It's going to be, these 3 kids are going to learn better together from this instructor than another set of 3 kids.
Yes, total open, like, I think such a right field for research, and like really meaningful applied research on how can we best do tutoring. I think it's a great line of inquiry.
Yeah. So one last question really quick. What are the biggest challenges preventing other states from implementing Americorps tutoring programs? I mean, obviously Minnesota is killing it. You guys are doing like just amazing work. And I'm maybe on another webinar, we'll learn a little bit more about how Minnesota became such a hotbed for tutoring. But how can other states start to make this happen, with it going in the same way that Minnesota's doing it?
Well, where it's happening, I mean, I think it's a coordination of the states. It can actually happen at a state level or a district level. So ingredient number 1, some sort of state or district champion. Ingredient number 2, the local Americorps offices, or the state's kind of Americorps resources. Every state has them. So those 2 ingredients are there. And then it's kind of working with the Americorps program that fits kind of what you're looking for. So that's what has drawn us into other states, for example.
And does it necessitate like an organization like a ServeMinnesota saying, hey, we're going to take the reins of this and say, like, we're going to be the drivers as we kind of collaborate between schools and districts and Americorps to kind of make things happen? Or can it happen sort of independent of having an organization like ServeMinnesota in place?
I think it can. There's always going to be a complexity of running the Americorps program. So there's like, the sort of administrative side. So finding an organization that can do that and then take your idea and implement it. So you take away the administrative side and you say, let's focus on the tutoring side. And then that can unlock these Americorps dollars, allow it to get your tutoring program up off the ground. And then you start to gather evidence. Then you go to your state legislators and you ask for state money, and you get, and then you scale. Just like that. This is really easy, right? But I think the start is like, good idea for a tutoring program, well-designed theory of change, connecting with an organization that has the infrastructure to administer the Americorps program. And I think that's a logical first step, is, of course, connecting with your commissions, as David said. So I know we're at time here, so I will stop. talk.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys so much. This has been really incredibly interesting. Like, thank you, Dave, Pete, for all that you're doing and your amazing work. We plan to make notes, videos, and transcripts related to today's webinar available to all. We always put tons of money behind making sure that we can get as many people seeing this video as possible because it's been awesome. If you're already planning to participate in serving government funding or funded tutoring programs or are looking for a technical partner on one platform to implement your program, please schedule a time to chat with me via the link posted by Michael. This link will also be sent out to everyone via email when we send out the webinar video. Please pass it along to folks that you think will find it interesting. Have a great rest of your day. And again, thank you guys so much.
Thanks for having us, Nate.
Thank
It was
you.
awesome.